Today we're going to be talking about a new predictive model that is really helping us better understand sales momentum among the vendors that we're watching. And I'm really excited to have Taylor joining me to be able to walk us through this really exciting analysis that we're looking at.
Well, it is so good to be here, Rebecca. This is an area of research that I've been working on for about 10 years here at KLAS. And we have gotten better and better at tracking sales in the market. And so now we're at a place where we can build a really strong model and we have really strong predictions. And we're really excited to share these things that we've learned. So this is a culmination of about a decade's worth of work. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, to kick things off, I'd love if you could walk us through what really inspired this particular model and the data that we're using here and what we're starting to learn from it.
So we know as we work with different vendors, there's some vendors who intuitively understand the criticality of just listening to their customers and then improving. There's others who say, KLAS, help me understand what is the business case for listening to my customers. And then we can really make a difference and we can really listen and improve. And then even among all of those who are trying to listen for whatever reason, there's always the question of what are we listening for? So what is the connection between our customer satisfaction this year and our sales next year? And that's a lot of what we're looking at today with this model, is trying to understand, can we listen to the feedback of the customer and be able to have a good idea of where the vendor is going? And even more than just being able to predict the future, we're wanting to influence the future. We're wanting to know why customer feedback is indicating that a vendor or a product will or will not be successful in their sales momentum in the next year. And what are some of the adjustments that companies can make in order to be more competitive? And all of this comes back to listening to the customer. So as we talk about this, I think sales momentum is the term that we're using, which is a little bit of a cloud word. It could mean a lot of different things, but this is the way that we're thinking through it, Rebecca. The idea of a flywheel is really similar to what we see with a lot of companies. It's really hard to get going when you have no customers and when you have no proof points of your success. So if you're a new entrant into the healthcare IT market, you're trying to get some of those success points and try to move forward. If you've been in the market for a number of years, you have dozens or hundreds of customers, you have a lot of momentum in the market. But all of that momentum is really centered around the things that you're doing for your current customers. So as we think about the market and we think about sales success, we think about it this way. We think that there's a flywheel that really is the demonstration of your success that you're able to show to customers and to show to the market. And then there's how well are you harnessing the energy from that flywheel, right? So how much are you converting that energy really efficiently? In those cases, you probably have a really good sales and marketing team. There's some companies that have a lot of energy in the market. They don't convert a lot of that energy into sales energy. They just don't have very good sales and marketing teams. And sometimes that's by choice, which can make a lot of sense, especially if they're working to have a very conservative and very steady delivery to the market. But after you have that initial energy, that demonstration of momentum, you're able to convert that. That's where you get the energy, which really is in the form of new sales and also retaining customers. So this is really the core of what we're looking at today. And I think I have to warn you as we walk through this, it's going to be pretty heavy. I have a background in statistics, and I am like a pig in mud when it comes to statistics. I also know that some of our audience is going to have a pretty heavy analytical background. So I'm going to speak to them maybe a little bit more. I'll try to make it understandable. And we're going to talk about that. We also have another video that is maybe the more basic, just, hey, we have a predictive model. We're not going to explain it all the way, but here's roughly what it is. And you can use this model. So we're going to get into the heart and guts of this today.
Yes, in that video, we'll really talk through what do we do with this information and how can I take action with the information that's coming out of that model. And so be on the lookout for that as well. It is interesting, Taylor, as you share this flywheel and this engine, I think the flywheel piece is really what people have known KLAS for historically, of really understanding how are we measuring the success that vendors are having with customers and really harnessing that information and pairing it with the sales and marketing success data that we have also had the chance to gather over the years to really start to identify this momentum. So let's dive on in.
Great. Well, before we even start talking about the model and some of the data, something that we see with AI models in healthcare is that no model is good if you don't have a plan of what you're going to do once you have your prediction, right? And so we see some healthcare organizations, they say, hey, we really want to predict if a patient is going downhill or if they're going to become septic, for instance, right? But if they have no plans in place to do something once they know this, right? Other than people just looking at it saying, oh, that is not good that Mrs. White is about to go septic, right? If there's no plans in place, then you might as well not even do the model at all. Mm-hmm. So let's talk real quick before we even jump into the model. Let's talk about what do we do when we know this information. And so let's talk about, as you're watching this and as you're learning, you're going to be able to see if you're a vendor. By the way, we're only sharing this with vendors. We're not sharing this with providers. KLAS is not in the business of sharing predictive models with providers and having that influence their buying decisions. So if you're a vendor and you're watching this and you're able to see, hey, KLAS is predicting based off of this model that we're going to have really high sales success. What does that mean for you? Well, what it means is based off of the feedback of customers, there's some things that you're doing right. You can look at what you're doing and say, how do we keep doing that right? It also helps you know that, hey, we're likely positioned fairly well to capitalize off of some of the momentum that we've built in the market. And so we should be ready for that. We should be scaled up. We should be ready for new customers. We should be ready to capitalize on that. And then third, if you're not seeing some of that success, all predictive models have limits. And so there could be some other factors that are really limiting your success. But if you're not seeing some of that success, you can start to examine and say, well, maybe there's other pieces. Maybe we're not harnessing that momentum very well. And so there's a number of things that organizations should be doing once they know whether they have a strong predictive score or if they have a weak predictive score. Obviously, they can start to make some changes. They can start to know that maybe the challenge is not their sales and marketing team. Maybe it's actually the momentum that they have not built or some of the negative momentum that they've built. And that's an even more challenging place in a lot of cases when you've built a lot of negative momentum and you have a lot of customers out there saying, no, this vendor is not innovative. No, this vendor doesn't know how to integrate. No, they're not very much of a partner. And as we listen to the feedback of customers, all of this, 100% of the data that we're talking about today comes from customers. And again, this all comes back down to listening to your customers. And so that's what we're talking about today as we talk about this model.
All right. So with that being said, are we ready?
I think we're ready. Let's jump in. Okay. Let's jump in. We're prepared. So let's talk first about the data. And you know this data as well as anybody, Rebecca. Our Decision Insights data is something that we've been now collecting for going on 5 years. And this started because for a lot of years, and this is probably foolish of us, we would talk to healthcare leaders and they'd say, hey, we're making this decision, and we wouldn't write it down anywhere, and which seems almost silly. And so then about 4.5, almost 5 years ago, we started writing down what people were telling us, the decisions that they were making. And what do you know? We collected in that first year about 950 decisions that people told us. And we've continued to do that. The number of decisions that we hear about from our healthcare provider organization friends, executives, is now getting close to 1,500 decisions, unique decisions at unique different organizations across about 50 different market segments that we watch. And so now as we track these decisions, that gives us a baseline, a sample of what are the vendors that different provider organizations are considering as they go out to market. And we track who they're considering and we track who they're leaning towards or who they've selected depending on when the decision is. So we may collect this right before the decision happens or after the decision happens, but we're just trying to track any decisions that we hear about.
Yeah, so it's a great natural pairing with our traditional customer experience data because this is allowing us to really understand what do they feel like they're being sold? How are they evaluating these vendors? What do they see as being their strengths and weaknesses as they talk to their peers, as they consult data? And it's a really natural progression of understanding the full expectations of the customer as they start working in partnerships with their solutions.
Well, and it gets fun because we're planning right now on putting out these predictions of sales and retention every year. And then the next year, we're going to kind of grade ourselves in terms of how good were our predictions, right? And over time, they'll get better and better as the model gets stronger and we have more information. So we'll tweak the model every year. But the question is, here's what we predicted, what actually happened. And so we look forward to 2023. Hopefully, we're both able to be back here and to look at, well, how well did we do on the predictions that we put out? So looking forward to that.
Yes, that will be fun.
This is where I've presented this to a number of different companies. And this is the place where I always lose people. So you're going to have to help make sure that we don't lose our audience on this piece.
Order and structure to what we're walking through.
Absolutely. So as we talk about this, we really need a way to define what is sales energy. And I think that there's a few just, if you look at this briefly and you've never thought about it before, you say, well, what's the percentage of the time that you're considered? Or what's the percentage of the time that you're selected out of all the decisions that are happening out there? But there's more variables than just that. And let me just give an example here. Let's take a look at maybe two different markets. And these are fictionalized. This is not real data. But let's look at two different markets. In one market, KLAS has recorded 12 different decisions. In another market, we've recorded 18 decisions. In one market, there's 3 vendors. In another, there's 6 vendors. And so we realize as we look at this that the number of vendors is a key variable that needs to be included into our ubiquitous measure of how we measure sales energy. Because in a market, so for instance, in the ERP market, we see primarily 3 vendors that are competing in that market. Workday, Oracle, and Infor in order of their KLAS scores. So, and we see all 3 of those competing. If everything is equal, and we see, say, 30 decisions in a year that we record, you would expect that each of those vendors would maybe win about 10 deals. In another market like population health, we may be tracking 15 different vendors. If there's 30 decisions in population health, well, you would be expecting that each of those vendors would maybe be winning on average 2. Mm-hmm. And so we need a different way to define success depending on the number of decisions that we're coming across and the number of vendors that we see in the market. So that's where we came up with this formula, and we're going to try to make this formula make sense for you so that it is not just some made up formula, so that this is something that you can really intuitively understand.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I want to clarify here is that you are giving considerations some weight here, but it looks like they are not getting as much weight as a selection. So walk me through how we're thinking about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So our numerator there is a weighted sum, is really what we're looking at. And in some cases, we come across decisions where I just had one of these interviews this morning where the individual was saying, hey, we're looking at these 3 vendors. And then I said, do you know who you're going to select? Well, no, we don't know yet, right? So we really do need to make those considerations worth something. Mm-hmm. And because we don't always know who the organization is leaning towards or who they've selected, right?
So who's even being brought to the table and understanding those that aren't even being invited into the possibility of a deal.
And roughly on average, if we see a vendor considered 3 times, one of those times they'll be selected. It's just roughly what we see. It's a little bit below that, but that's the reason why we came up with the weighted sum of 3 to 1. Mm-hmm. And so let's use that market number 1 that we talked about and describe both the numerator and the denominator and try to make this make sense. So if we look, here's our formula. And let me maybe start with the denominator first, which is the intuition that we already talked about. If you have 12 decisions the KLAS has come across and 3 vendors, you're going to expect that each vendor will win 4 decisions, right? Mm-hmm. And so as we do this, we're able to, all you do is you take the total number of decisions divided by the total number of vendors who are considered or selected. Mm-hmm. So that's how we get the denominator of the total of vendors who are actively selling, anybody who we see that we've come across that showed up in any of these deals. And then in the numerator, we do that weighted average that we talked about before. So in this case, Orange had 8 wins. So you would say, wow, they won twice as much as we would expect them to sell, everything else equal, mm-hmm. right? And then Purple and Green had a combination of wins and considerations. So their numerators are less than 4. And in this case, Purple had more considerations, so their numerator is a little bit higher. Meaning that this is a sample, and if they're getting more at-bats, if they're getting considered more, there's probably more selections that we didn't quite catch up to, right? Mm-hmm. And so we would guess that they're getting a little bit of a higher sales share. And so this is how the sales shares pop out in this market. They don't average to 1, so they're not all the way perfect because people can consider a lot of vendors. But the intuition here is that a sales share of 1 means that all things equal, you're probably winning about the amount of the market that you would expect.
You're getting your share of the pie.
You're getting your share of the pie. It's average, right? Yeah. And then once you go beyond that, it starts getting to be a lot more.
Okay. So as we're looking at this, those with the sales share over 1, they're seeing more energy in terms of considerations, in terms of selections, and those that are generally falling below 1 are trailing behind what we would say is kind of the market leader in terms of the energy there.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So I think the next step as we look at this, so now we've talked about what our data is, we've talked about how we're going to define it. Any fellow nerds out there are getting really excited because this is the part where we really start digging into to what's going on. And a lot of times when you're doing these things, you want to start with what you call the parsimonious model. So just the most simple model that you possibly can. Let's look at the main variable that we're let's look at the correlation between the two key variables that we're trying to look at. And so we want to start there, and then we're going to build complexity on top of the model. And so let's just look at the very basic data. And I want to describe something that I haven't quite described yet. So as we're looking at the sales share, and then as we're looking at the KLAS score, because KLAS has tracked things longitudinally over time, we're actually able to say, well, what is the KLAS score, for instance, in 2019? And then what was the sales share in 2020? Mm-hmm. So just for consistency's sake, all of this analysis is based off of calendar year windows, and we're looking at the performance in 1 year and then the sales share in the next year. So the feedback of the customers in year 1, the sales share the next year, and we're completely consistent as we go through all of this analysis that way. So it is a correlation. Proving causation is always tough, but it is a time difference correlation, mm-hmm. which hopefully gets it even one more step towards something that would be closer to causation.
So with the idea being, if we can really understand the customer's experience, where they're having success and where they're feeling frustration, can we then leverage this model to predict the sales and retention that vendor could expect based on how they're treating their existing customers?
Exactly right. So we've already we've collected all of the feedback from customers in 2021. Because of the nature of poor time travel technology, we cannot collect any more feedback from customers in 2021. So that book is closed. We can now take all of that information and use it to predict what we're going to see in 2022, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're talking about in this series, is using that feedback from customers in 1 year to predict the next year. So as we look at this, if you look at what the KLAS score is in 1 year, and then you look at what the sales share is in the next year, we actually see a very statistically significant correlation here. And however, we're going to talk about this, it could be a better predictive correlation. So something that is statistically significant means on average, this is true, but it doesn't mean that the next case or variable that you come across is going to for sure follow that rule, mm-hmm. right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we do see is on average, if a company has a KLAS 1 point increase in their KLAS score, we tend to see a 3.7% increase in their sales share, percentage point increase in their sales share the next year. So this is a big jump. Jumping up your KLAS score by 10 points could as much as double your sales share in a correlation or possibly a causation. You get to decide on which of those two it is, right? And then we see something really interesting. We see that the KLAS scores between 80 to 90 and then to 90 plus. We actually see that the sales share goes down slightly in that group of 90 plus. And we think that is almost completely described by the new product effect. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is we looked at those products. What are those products that have a score over 90? A lot of times these are products that are new to the market. They're very new in their life cycle. They're early in terms of getting their sales energy. So they have some sales energy, but their momentum is lower in terms of proof points with their current customers. And then as they tend to scale up, we tend to see KLAS scores fall into the 80s or below. And what we see over time is that if you start out in the 90s and your KLAS score falls into the 80s and it stays there, then you could have runaway market energy. If your KLAS score falls below the 80s because you weren't able to scale very well, those are a lot of times the products that have a fairly short lifespan in the market. And so probably a discussion for another time, but looking at where a product is in its life cycle, which we measure by the median number of years live reported by current customers, looking at that is something that can be really helpful for us.
Yeah, definitely. So as we're looking at this breakout, although you might have the highest score in that particular segment, doesn't mean you're going to have this runaway market energy, especially as people are small, growing, figuring out how to scale their people and their processes. And so this is really fascinating to look at who's getting this runaway energy. Where is this landing?
Absolutely. And let's dive into some of this, the predictive power, but you hit it right on the head, Rebecca, which is that If you have a low class score, it's actually a fairly good predictor of low market energy. So a really low class score means that you have a lot of customers out there talking negatively. And in order to have good sales momentum that drives into sales energy, you're going to have to overcome that, and it's really tough to do. However, a high class score is not a good predictor of necessarily runaway market energy. And as we talk about that, let's look at the observed market energy that we see from all these different firms, right? So this is an interesting, a right-tailed histogram is what we're looking at here. So you have a lot of firms that have low or medium market energy that are skewed towards just a little bit of the market. And then you have this tail over to the right-hand side. And so on the left-hand side, we're going to define as anything with a sales share below 0.5 is something that we would say is uncompetitive. It's not competing very well in the market. And anything with a sales share above a 3 is something that we'd say, wow, that's runaway market energy. They're seeing the sales share of 3 different companies right now. And obviously that small group of products and vendors that have runaway market energy, they are, in essence, taking away the energy from all the rest of the competitors out there. And we are able to quantify based off of the feedback of their customers to be able to see that correlation. So if we look at these groups and we look at the correlation between the class score, here's your likelihood of falling into either group. Now notice that if we look at the likelihood of being uncompetitive, if we look at any products over the last 4 years that have had a class score below a 60, those products 2/3 of the time have ended up falling into that uncompetitive group the next year. So if you have a class score, and even that group that's in the 60s, so if you have a score below 70, there is a better than not chance that you are going to be in that uncompetitive group the next year. And that's probably not too surprising. However, what's surprising is that even as we start seeing those companies and those firms with a class score up in the 80s or the 90s, now all of this is software, by the way, so I should be really clear, but those products up in the 80s or the 90s, there's still some of those that we would classify as uncompetitive. And that could be that they're not capturing their momentum, or it could be that there's a challenge with their momentum. It's not just satisfaction. There's more things that go into this as we talk about. On the right-hand side, though, as we look at the likelihood of runaway sales, now you'll notice that the middle column there, likelihood of being uncompetitive, that jumps up over 4x between the below 60 to the above 90, right? Runaway sales, it's not even a 3x difference right there, meaning that it's just not as predictive on that side to be able to predict where the runaway energy is. And for anybody who has a strong, nerd background, here's the scatter plot and the table showing what is the class score and then what did we see in terms of the sales share. And you can see again, most of those products with a low class score tend to fall pretty close to an uncompetitive side. But those products with a high class score, there's still a lot of those that are also uncompetitive. And so here's the data as we look at just the class score. And so we need to take this model and make it better. And as we talk about here, we're going to be able to make this model maybe about 4 times better than what it is right now. Although this by itself is really quite interesting to know as you're in the market in terms of, hey, what does my class score likely mean for me in the future?
Yeah, I think the question that a lot of people will have in looking at this is, all right, then what is the difference? How are people getting this runaway energy if the class score isn't going to predict those that are experiencing that? Let's dig in here. Let's figure out what those differences are.
Perfect. So we're going to need to, in order to really improve the model, we need to talk about a new term here. We're going to call it rank. And let me just, before I describe rank, let me describe 2 different products, and maybe I'll turn the tables and ask you a question here, Rebecca. So Rebecca, you've led our consulting team. You've been in dozens, probably hundreds of boardrooms of different vendors, virtually and in person, and you've seen the feedback from customers on all these different products. If we had 2 products and they both had the very same class score, and one of those products, the highest rated questions are, support and lots of functionality. The lowest rated questions are innovation with delivery of new technology, executive involvement, supports integration goals. So that's product A. Product B is really the reverse of that, right? So that innovation, partnership, integration, those are the highest rated products. let me just ask you, and this is just to generalize or maybe even to stereotype each of these two products. On average, what would you expect to be seeing in each of these two products? How are they different, probably?
Yeah, I mean, our metrics are not all created equal.
Yes.
As we ask these questions, and the things that really help move the needle for customers are not all going to be equal. So while they might have the same class score, as we look at this variation in which are the highest rated questions, there's likely going to be a higher level of optimism, a higher level of partnership with one of these vendors. And as I look at these two, I would be placing my bet on vendor B, because with delivery of new technology, which we know is an alignment around vision, alignment around product development, listening to your customer, and working towards these developmental goals, executive involvement, which is really a relationship-based metric where they have close lines of communication, they're working with empowered individuals, and then of course supports integration goals. Taking that frustration off the table of having a product that doesn't integrate with the rest of your software stack is so frustrating and costly. So as I look at these two vendors, vendor B is in a position where they're likely going to have higher optimism scores, higher likely to recommend scores, because their customers are in line with the vision where they're growing and really the outcomes that their customers are hoping to achieve, versus a vendor A where those same things are their lowest rated scores, and they have kind of just some stable metrics. Phone and web support, they're able to get support when they need it. The product has even functionality. It's giving them what they need at its baseline, but they're not necessarily innovating and growing and developing new opportunities to drive new outcomes with those customers.
Yeah, and if we were to even take a step, build on what you said, Rebecca, and take a step. So if we were to generalize, vendor A might be a product that's maybe been in the market for 10 or 15 years. They're really stable when it comes to some of these support metrics. They have a lot of functionality because they've been around for a long time, right? But their innovation has gotten stale. Their partnership has gotten stale. They're in a rinse and repeat type of model. They're not innovating and trying to change and grow. And their integration maybe is low because the customers that we're interviewing have moved on and they don't fit the new integration path going forward, right? Where vendor B, maybe they have low phone and web support because they're growing so fast, right? Because they're innovative, because there's that partnership. So what we're looking at here is two products with the same class score, but there's a signal here. And the signal is based off of what questions are rated high and which questions are rated low. And so the idea in rank is really to not look at necessarily what are the actual ratings for a specific vendor or a product, but just to say what's the order of those rankings. So 1 would be, hey, this is the lowest rated question. And so it could be the lowest rated question and the vendor has a score of a 95 and the lowest rated question is an 8.5. It could be a vendor that has a score of a 60 and the lowest rated question is a 5.5. But at the end of the day, we don't care about the 8.5 or the 5.5. What we really care about is what is relatively higher and what is relatively lower. And let me give you an example here. And you know who these two vendors are, and I think that many of our listeners may know who they are, but who they are is a lot less important than what the trend is. And so let's talk about a space where we have watched, not just using decision insights, but in the acute EMR market, KLAS has done a census on all new deals, and we've done this now for about 17 years. And so this is a great market for us to be able to compare. So let's compare two vendors who are roughly the same size, and let's look at some of their ranks. Now I'm going to zero in on one question specifically, which is, what is the rank for the question likely to recommend? And so if we look at these two vendors, one of them, you can see likely to recommend is their highest rank, so it has a rank of 15, okay? And this is the data from 2021. Their competitor has a rank of 4 on likely to recommend. So yes, the competitor has lower class scores, right? But there's more signal than just the class scores in where these ranks are. And actually, if we look over the last several years, it's really interesting. You can see vendor 1 has had a rank of 15 for the last, from 2017 through 2020. They've held on to their customers really well. They've had good sales, but you can even see that their sales as a share of the market have gone up quite a bit in 2019 and 2020. They're actually outselling in terms of number of hospitals their competitor, vendor number 2. And really what's the change that we've seen? Vendor number 2, if you look at their likely to recommend rank, it's gone from close to 15 down to 5, and then this past year it was at 4. And so what's the signal that we're seeing from customers? We're seeing customers say, at the end of the survey, they rate everything high or low. At the end of the survey, though, they're tepid compared to their other ratings in terms of saying, yeah, I'd recommend this product. I think that this is the product going forward. And with vendor number 1, they've never been tepid. And actually, if you look at their ratings here for vendor number 1, likely to recommend not just as staying at 15, but it's actually pulling out more. And so you could argue that it's becoming even more of a dominant product in the minds of its customers. And what does that mean? That means that there's a lot of customers out there saying, this is the best product in the market. And this is the premier product in the market. And they're encouraging others to look at this as they expect that this is the premier product in the market. So this is a microcosm before we jump into the model of just 2 different vendors, but how there's a lot of signal in this rank variable that we're looking at here.
Yeah, so vendor 1 consistently, even as these scores have maybe adjusted or shifted over the years, likely to recommend continues to be their top performing metric year over year over year consistently, regardless of what that actual number is.
Yep.
So yeah, that's fascinating as we look at vendor 2 to see as that rank slips for likely to recommend, so does their sales energy around, how many hospitals are they selling and how many hospitals are they losing over the years. It's fascinating to look at it just specifically by that metric.
And what's really interesting is that while the rank data has changed quite a bit on these 2 vendors over time, the actual KLAS scores have stayed just within a few points of their historical averages. So the KLAS scores are staying pretty level, but the rank data is really diverging in a pretty dramatic way. And that is correlated with what we're seeing in terms of sales momentum. As we look at Decision Insights data for 2021, in terms of where this is going, we continue to see a pretty strong divergence between these 2 companies. And vendor number 2, who used to win a lot more, is now winning less and less and less. And we believe that that's tied back to the feedback from their own customers and the feedback from competitive customers, where there's this growing market consensus that this is the leading product in the market. And if you're looking at something, you probably want to go with this one, right?
This is so critical because as you think, as you mentioned that their overall scores have stayed somewhat consistent, it would be hard to necessarily know, well, we're getting this positive feedback in these particular areas, but that's not necessarily highlighting where they might be really having customers that are struggling in other areas that are stronger predictors of that retention and that loyalty and new sales energy.
Absolutely. So this is something really to keep an eye on, and something that's not hard to keep an eye on as you are looking at your KLAS feedback, but now you know where to look. So let's jump into the full model. We could build a better predictive model if we used, neural nets or some sort of other term a lot of times is non-parametric type of model. However, we're using just a regular regression here in order to do this. We used a lasso variable selection technique in order to be able to say of all these different ranks, and we actually looked at all the correlations with overall satisfaction. Of all these correlations, all these ranks, the median number of years life, and the KLAS score, which of these variables should we include that are good predictors? And the lasso variable selection is just a tool. It's pretty simple. It looks at all of those and it says, yep, if you get this subset is pretty good at predicting where this is going to go. And so this identified 6 variables that we want to look at. And with the exception of median years life, all of these are ranks. So what's really interesting as we look at this model is that while the overall KLAS score was able to predict, and it was a statistically significant predictor, the model, it actually falls out of the model. So once you start adding rank in, it doesn't add a lot more value to the model, and the lasso variable selection just drops it out and says, no, let's not look at that. Let's look at these rank variables. And but we're using a standard regression because this is going to give us more insights into why a prediction is one way or the other. So we can make stronger predictions, but there's a trade-off. When we make those stronger predictions with something like a neural net, we may not be able to make, or it's a lot more work to be able to make some of the same inferences. And with the standard regression, this becomes pretty straightforward. And what we see here is a model compared to just using the KLAS score to predict future success, now we see a model that's almost 5 times better at predicting sales than just what we saw with the KLAS score. So as you can see, these are the standard coefficients here in the second column. And you can see that all of these coefficients are positive except for 2. And so let's talk about the positive ones first. Delivery new technology. So this is our innovation question. And I had an interview this morning with a CEO of a large oncology group in New York. And as we were talking about the firm that he was giving feedback on, I asked the innovation question. He said, "Oh my gosh, they are so innovative." A 9, right? So as we talk about delivering new technology, that a lot of times means innovation to folks. Executive involvement, when we see that question, there's a lot to unpack there, but a lot of times it means partnership, right? Do you have executives that you're really listening to, and what does that look like? We've already talked about likely to recommend, and supports integration goals is pretty straightforward. So what we're seeing actually is with these questions, which is really interesting, we released a white paper now about 11 years ago. We didn't have the decision insights data, but we had other data, and it was looking at how can the KLAS fingerprint predict future sales success. And we saw the very same thing 11 years ago, which was innovation, partnership, and integration are the 3 greatest predictors of future success. And that continues to be the case. The question likely to recommend is a newer question in the last 8 years. And so that has the best predictive power, actually. And then we see the median number of years live. Not surprising as we see customers on average saying, "Yep, I've been live with this for a long time." The sales prediction should go down a little bit. So that just means that the product is probably further into its life cycle. But the one question here that's interesting is you have a negative coefficient with money's worth. And I call this the Honda Accord effect. And the reason why I use that is that when I was first married, we bought a very used Honda Accord, and then we just drove that thing for years, and we duct taped it together literally at times, and we kept that going. So if somebody called me up and said, "How good is your Honda Accord? How well have you received your money's worth?" I'd give them the highest ratings that I could. Then they said, "Would you recommend this Honda Accord to somebody else?" And I'd say, "Absolutely not." And so what we're seeing here with money's worth is these again, probably products that are further in their life cycle, or people feel like that they have extracted the value out of them. Successful products, customers don't yet feel like they've extracted the value out of them. And there's new frontiers that they're excited for and they're looking forward to.
I would also add that we also see that in really tactical, straightforward needs that some of these products serve, where they're not getting innovation, they're not getting a level of complexity or maturity, but it is checking that basic box that they needed from that vendor.
Yep.
And so they're getting good money's worth because they can recognize it's a cheap solution. It's doing this very specific thing for me, but do I plan to grow with this vendor? Do I plan to innovate? Not necessarily.
Exactly. So if we put this into a context that a lot of people recognize, because we've been using the KLAS fingerprint for a lot of years, and really if you look at the KLAS fingerprint, it has this idea of rank built into it, right? So we're not really looking at what are the scores on the left-hand y-axis, right? We're looking at what's relatively high and what's relatively weak. And then we're looking at the correlations, which does, by the way, the correlations, they fell out of the model, but they do have some predictive power. So there is some information there. But here's the fingerprint of those high decile selling solutions. And you can see those questions that we have highlighted there are some of the strongest questions. Overall product quality is interesting. That question fell out of the model, but it was the last one to fall out of the model. And so the overall product quality is another fairly predictive question. And then you'll notice that delivering new technology, even for those top decile solutions, tends to be in the middle of the pack. This is a question that's really hard to get high ratings on. And it's less than 3% of products that see really, really high ratings, a really high rank of 10 or above on that question.
Well, it's a question that demands not only excellence in product development, but also in your relationship.
Absolutely.
How are you communicating that vision? How are you receiving feedback? And so as we unpack that question and look at the nuances of it, it requires a level of excellence from the broader company as a whole.
That's exactly right.
From top to bottom, really.
The amount of communication for strong delivery of new technology is really intense. You have to always be talking about, and as we all know, that's a two-edged sword. If you talk too much about what you're going to be doing and then you don't deliver on it very well, you could also get yourself in a real trouble spot in terms of not keeping promises with customers. So then as we look at a low sales fingerprint, so the lowest selling decile of solutions, now you'll see that delivering new technology falls to be the very lowest. So you have customers who are saying, yeah, this is a stagnant product, right? Again, as we talked about, some of these products have very high KLAS scores, but their lowest score is delivery of new technology, right? You'll notice that there's some other questions like likely to recommend now is in the middle to low, right? And supports integration goals, executive involvement have all fallen quite a bit. So
I do want to call out, because I'm curious, people may have questions around this forecasted overall satisfaction. That is in the top for both. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we highlighted that on purpose because we're going to talk about that. That's actually a much better predictor of retention, and you get an extra credit. You get a little extra model here beyond what you were expecting, because we actually also have a model of what is customer retention going to look like next year. And so forecasted overall satisfaction, not a good predictor of sales success, but so you'll see it here high, but then as we talk about just briefly our retention model, you'll see that it falls quite a bit in low retention products.
Okay, well, we will table that discussion after we finish this first model.
Absolutely. So let's look here at the geek data, and you're going to see fewer dots on the chart on this one. The reason is that we're not using the same data that we used to build the model to test the model, right? And so which is standard practice. And if we were doing that, then you should not trust what we're doing here. So you'll see about half the number of dots is what you saw before. But what you're able to see though is that the model, if the model predicts fairly high sales, there's a better than not chance that we're going to see pretty good sales. If the model predicts low sales, there's a better than not. And so now, actually, if we look here, the middle column, likelihood of being uncompetitive, it gets a little bit better, but where we really see great improvements here is that there's a 7x difference between a low sales prediction to a high sales prediction in terms of the likelihood of seeing runaway sales. And so now this model is getting a lot better at identifying when are we going to see runaway sales as it incorporates this rank variable into the model. So coming from here on, we should identify that we would love to make this webinar into an 8-hour webinar and talk through all of the predictions of where do we see sales and retention for the hundreds of products that we track. We're going to actually break that up into a set of webinars in late February that you can log into and actually ask questions as we go through. And we're going to have some of our analysts walk through and detail those markets in different areas. And so if you're sitting on the edge of your seat right now and you're saying, okay, so what does it look like for me? You are welcome to call up your KLAS representative and get some of this information early because we have it, we're sitting on it. But we're going to be walking everybody through this in a series of webinars here later in February. And then in March, we'll be publishing a report where all of this information will be available. Again, the webinars and the report, really we're only making available to our vendor partners out there. And both of those, just for full transparency, require a membership because we want to work with you because it's not just about what the predictions are. It's about what are the next steps to be able to work with you to make adjustments based off of this feedback.
Absolutely. So you mentioned extra credit. Are we going to get a chance to look at that?
Well, let's look at our extra credit. So here's our extra credit, right? And so we added in a model, and a lot of this model is very similar to the other. It's actually though the dependent variable in this model is just looking at the percentage of customers who say this vendor is part of my long-term plans. So we actually don't even use the Decision Insights data for this model. We just used we look at the KLAS score and the ranks for year one, and then we go back to year two, and all we look at is what percentage of customers that we interviewed say that this product is part of their long-term plans. And a really good indicator of what does loyalty look like for customers. And this model is interesting because not only does the KLAS score stay in this model as we did this lasso variable selection, it is by far and away the strongest variable. So your KLAS score is not a great predictor, although it is statistically significant, but it's not the strongest predictor of where you're going to go in terms of sales, but in terms of retention, it is a great predictor, which should not be a surprise. It's a sampling of your current customers and then their decision next year to choose to stay with you or not. But the consistency here is striking. Likely to recommend continues to be very strong. Money's worth is again there with a negative covariate. Supports integration goals and delivery new technology continue to be strong there. And then we see executive involvement, which does have a positive, statistically significant correlation, but with the lasso variable selection, it fell out. And instead, we see forecasted overall satisfaction, which is really our optimism question. So how much optimism do we see among customers? And this is a little bit low, but you can see here that the optimism question, it's almost always the highest rated question. In the few instances where we see that optimism question fall down, then you have a problem. So if forecasted overall satisfaction is not close, right up there, right by likely to recommend, close to the very top rank, you really have a problem in terms of very, very, very predictive in terms of very weak retention in the following year. So I don't know, what's the weather analogy? A red moon means, right? In a similar way, but much more predictive, you can see that there's some strong correlations here. So here's that highest retention decile of solutions, and you can see where these questions land, and then you can see where they drop, and where they drop if it's to the lowest decile retention of solutions. And so here's the scatter plot. This model is a little over 2.5 times, is about 2.5 times as strong as the sales model. And which is unsurprising, because we're looking at the feedback of customers this year and then seeing if those same customers want to stick around next year, right? And so we have an R squared of about 48, which means that this predicts about 48% of the variation. And you can see here that if the model predicts high retention, it's right about 80% of the time. If it predicts low retention, it's right about 80% of the time. And so two important models to be taking a look at that can really help companies know what's possibly coming, and then hopefully change their future as they listen more to their customers and use that feedback to really make a difference.
And this is so helpful, because as you're looking at generating sales momentum, what good is that if your customers are going to leave you because you're not fulfilling on the promises that you've made? So it absolutely makes sense to pair these together to look at really the whole health of the customer experience with each vendor.
You know, it's an interesting thing as we work with a lot of vendors. We are so inspired by some vendors who work with us and are willing to take really, really hard feedback and listen to that. We see other vendors who really shy from taking some of the hard feedback and staring in the mirror. So this is not always fun to look at. And but we can almost guarantee that as you look at it and as your team looks at it and as you start to really to bring this in and to say, okay, so here's what our customers are saying, it's always better to know and then to make decisions based off of knowing. And so we look forward to working with all of your companies and your teams as you better understand what are some of the greatest signals that we can see in the feedback of our customers, and then what are some of the changes that we can go do. And there's a lot of changes that every company can do to better capitalize off of the momentum that they're building with their customers and to create different momentum that will be stronger.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Taylor, for joining us today in our Vendor Excellence series. If you have made it this far, you must be an Uber nerd too. And here at KLAS, we love Uber nerds. As Taylor mentioned, we will have a report coming out in March. We will also have, like Taylor mentioned, some subsequent series on very specific market segments to walk through what is happening in those spaces. So be on the lookout for those things as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.